Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Whittlesey, if you could take your seat, please. Mr. Whittlesey, if you could take your seat, please. There's always a troublemaker from the State Department somewhere around, isn't there?
I protest.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Wilson Center, the nation's living memorial to the United States' only president who had a PhD. We're very happy to say that this is the 100th anniversary of Woodrow Wilson's inauguration as President of the United States. It's a very big year for us. It's a very big year for me because I've actually just started here at the Wilson Center. I have approximately 9 weeks of experience here. I began on the 5th of December. My name is Duncan Wood. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute here. And as many of you may be aware, the Mexico Institute has a long-standing interest and commitment to migration studies. Traditionally, of course, we've studied the question of migration from an economic point of view, from a political point of view, from the impacts of migration on American society, for the impact of migration on the communities in Mexico that are exporters of human capital, if you will. We've looked at migration very much as a question of push and pull factors. Right now, I am working with Médicos Sin Fronteras, Doctors Without Borders in Mexico City, and working on their business plan of how they're to proceed. And one of the questions they're actually very, very interested in is this question of climate change and migration. At the moment, a lot of their work is actually focused on the question of organized crime on public health in Mexico, but they're also beginning to look at the question of climate change on flows of people and how that impacts upon public health. This publication, which I'm delighted to be able to present here at the Wilson Center, is a terrific publication. I have to say, when I saw the title, I got excited. When I read the PDF version, I was even more excited. Then I was tired because it was a long publication in the PDF form. Then we got the printed version, and finally I could flick through it at will, and it's terrific. I highly recommend that you get hold of a copy. It's a very, very quotable report, or as I like to say these days, it's a very tweetable report, which I think is very, very important to get the word out there. While I was, before I came here to the Wilson Center, I was living in Mexico City for 17 years. I was a university professor down there. And so throughout the Felipe Calderón administration, the question of climate change became a priority for national policy. With questionable results in the end. We have legislation on the books, we have standards on the books. Whether or not the current government will be able to implement those standards and will really follow through with the action plan is another question. But one of the things that Felipe Calderón did was to really put Mexico at the forefront of the international debate about climate change and to really put it onto the national agenda as well. And when Felipe Calderón made the statement that Mexico was uniquely vulnerable to climate change, it really had a resonance at the national level, coming as it did in the aftermath of natural disasters that had taken place in successive years. What have we seen in Mexico? Well, intense flooding in many parts of the country, in particular in Tabasco a few years ago. Increased desertification, not only caused by climate change, but of course by human activity as well. Increased hurricanes, Mexico living right there on the edge of the Caribbean and of course the Gulf of Mexico, a wonderful hurricane generator that Mexico has to live alongside. And in the north of the country in particular, the problem of decreasing water supplies. All of these, of course, impact directly upon the issue that we're going to discuss here today. The report is fascinating because it includes an attempt at modeling how climate change will impact upon flows and movements of people. Whether you agree with the accuracy of the modeling is not really the point. The fact is that right now we have, because of this report, we have data that's on the table that we can begin to discuss. I think that's a very, very important point, is that finally people can say, well, it seems as that we have research that's there, government representatives in Mexico, government representatives from other countries can actually sit down and begin to talk with Mexico about what happens. The recommendations of this report, which I'm sure that Elizabeth and Michael and Jeff will be talking about in greater detail, are recommendations that could really apply to pretty much any country, I would say. The need for increased awareness of the impact of climate change on migration, the need for coordination and management of the issue, data collection, vulnerability assessment, managed migration, and information dissemination. Michael Wirtz, who is here from the Center for American Progress, who has a series of reports on different parts of the world, not including Mexico, on this, is obviously aware of the importance of getting the word out there about the impact of climate change on development in general, but in particular on migration. And that's really what we're all about here today. So welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm going to pass over to Jeff right now, who's going to make the formal introductions of the panelists. Please think of interesting questions and comments that you can make. If you don't have any interesting comments or questions, think of some gossip you can share with us at some point. Washington is a great gossip town, of course. And Jeff, I hand over to you. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Duncan. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the center. It's a great pleasure to have this discussion that we're having today on climate change, migration, and Mexico with launching of this report from RUSI, and to have Michael from the Center for American Progress joining us as well to join that discussion. We really have two institutions on either side of the Atlantic who are really making big contributions to this critically important, complex, challenging, vexing set of connections between climate and migration. But it's terrific that we're able to have this, excuse me, here at the center. So my name's Jeff DeBelko. Until a couple months ago, I was here at the center directing the Environmental Change and Security Program. Moved out to back home, actually, to Ohio University and direct the Environmental Studies Program, a professor at the Voinovich School for Leadership there. But do have the good fortune of staying connected with the Wilson Center and being able to contribute in a small way to continuing to facilitate these discussions that we've done under the Environmental Change and Security Program. It's one that has a rich tradition of working closely with our partners here at the center and the regional programs and the country programs. So it's wonderful to welcome Duncan and to, again, work with the Mexico Institute on a critical topic. And we at Environmental Change and Security Program and these topics have had a long partnership with USAID's Office of Population, or excuse me, we have a grant with them too, but conflict management and mitigation under a Resources for Peace project. And so this falls very much within that tradition. So it's terrific for us to be welcoming Elizabeth and Michael here for this discussion. Elizabeth, he's a research fellow at RUSI, which is the shorthand, but shorthand for the Royal United Service Institute for Defense and Security Studies in London, an absolutely critically important and influential think tank, kind of very closely connected to the government in ways that allow their input to be taken very seriously and integrated. And so critically important within the context of the government taking very seriously this climate and security set of issues. And so their support for this effort is not surprising, and certainly we can rest assured that the right people are reading and taking account in the UK context of the conclusions. Elizabeth is leading up as part of the Climate Change and Security Program, leading up the team that produced this report. She's had time both studying and working here in the United States, but also with connections to Bolivia and to Italy and throughout Europe. And so she really is bringing a variety of perspectives to the table, and we welcome her to the Center for the first time. We're welcoming back Michael Wirtz from the Center for American Progress. He's been a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center, so we're pleased to have him as a kind of an alumnus and member of the Wilson Center family. But Michael is been working on climate and security, and particularly climate migration, with his colleagues here at the Center for American Progress, and has produced a number of reports on this topic. And so we invited him to join this conversation to set the specific context and look at this topic on Mexico within the context of the larger climate migration and security questions that we're trying to grapple with and understand. And so it's terrific for him to join us. So I think, Elizabeth, we'll turn the floor over to you first, and then Michael, and then we'll have a discussion. And because we are webcasting the event, we ask that when it comes time to the Q&A, if you can wait for one of my colleagues to bring you a microphone so the folks online are able to hear your question as well. So thanks so much. Elizabeth? Whichever you prefer.
I think it's fine, or...
Excuse me.
with this one, I think, just with this one.
Should be.
Okay. So, thank you all for coming here today. Thank you, Duncan, for the invitation. It's my first time at the Woodrow Wilson Centre, so I'm really delighted to represent the Royal United Services Institute at once. So, as Jeffrey just said, I am working at the Climate Change and Security Program. Actually, our program just has been closed, but we have just opened another program which is called FEW. It's Food, Energy and Water, and it will be looking at the resource future. In the past 15 months, we've been working on this project, which is called Climate Change, Migration and Security for Mexico. Best practice policy and operational options, of course, and so the part of the recommendations are very specific for the Mexican government. I mean, I'm the leading author, but of course, there's a lot of people who has been working with me, especially the co-author, which is Dr. Jorge Mora. He's from the Technological of Monterrey. And I'm actually going to show you all the people that is been working with us. First of all, our project has been commissioned by the UK FTO through the UK Embassy in Mexico. And we did have two big partners, Globe International, but with their headquarters in Mexico, and also the Iberoamericana, the University of Iberoamericana, Erubiel Tirado. He was our security consultant for this project. And also we had external consultants from the UNAM University, all scientists who were generating the atmospheric data that we needed, because atmospheric data at the municipal level are not available right now in Mexico, so we had to generate them for this specific project. And also we had an advisory panel, 8 Mexican government dependencies were peer reviewing the final draft. But we also had Dr. Susan Martin from Georgetown University, that I assume all of you know her very well. And also Dr. Fernando Aragon, who is member of the IPCC and is in the group 2 for sustainability and adaptation. I would like to tell a little bit about the content. This is a very big and long report, more than 100 pages, that I hope you will find the time to read at some point. So in terms of because of timing and also because I would like to give the floor to my colleagues, I will just give you a general view of the qualitative as well as the quantitative analysis that we did for this report and why we decided to do it. The justification, of course, the importance of the case study for us, which is Mexico, and also our key findings, and of course some of the recommendations. The research question and the purpose. Of course, there is growing consensus that the emissions of greenhouse gases as a result of human activity, is causing changes in temperature, precipitation levels, sea levels, the increase of sea levels, and the increase of frequency of extreme weather events. At the same time, we see that there is an it's increasingly accepted, if you want to, the possible link that may exist between climate change and migration. And so our research question for this specific study was, how will these changes in the climate impact migratory patterns in Mexico, and what would be the repercussions in terms of human security? In terms of the purpose, of course, I think as any academic, it is to enhance the fundamental understanding and awareness of these possible nexus, climate change, migration, and security. Also bolstered international evidence base. So this is the first time where RUSI decided to go outside its comfort zone and to embrace a qualitative as well as a quantitative analysis. So that's why we decided to collaborate with leading academics in Mexico who are experts on atmosphere studies and economics. So the model that we use is an econometric model designed specifically for this possible nexus, and also to provide evidence and support of good governance and best practice policy decisions, and implementation in Mexico. I would say that 90% of our recommendations are based on already policies that are in place or institutions that are in place or initiatives that have started. So we're just trying to tweak a little bit and try to see how collaboration could be enhanced and, just maybe increase certain parts of certain departments and try to, collect better data and so on. But all the recommendations basically are using current institutions and current projects. And of course, foster the development of a shared language. I mean, this goes even at the very basic level of what migration means and what security means and what this nexus or this possible nexus means. Because it seems that a lot of institutions and a lot of experts have their own definitions, and sometimes it looks like we are not even speaking about the same topic. Before we started this, or just when we started this project, I mean, this project is the continuation of another study that RUSI conducted in the region in Central America and Mexico. It was not looking at the factor of migration, it was just climate change and security. But one of the results of that study that was concluded in 2010 was that migration could be impacted by climate change in Central America and Mexico. And so that was more or less the impetus to start, or to continue this study, but focusing exclusively on Mexico. But we had 3 points that were quite clear to us, and so they were like the basis of this new research. And the one is that the phenomenon of migration is very complex. And is multicultural, so influenced by demographic, social, political, economical, and also environmental aspects that are push and pull factors, of course. Excuse me. The second point is regarding to security. I mean, we are a security think tank, but how we envision security in this project includes the threats to security beyond the military sphere and beyond that traditional definition, the police definition, if you want to, and addresses human security with a focus on individuals and communities building on their own resilience. So in human security for us, resilience is paramount. And this is the focus we give when we talk about the nexus, climate change, migration, and security. We are talking about human security. And also, we do not advocate for the strengthening of borders to limit massive flows of migrants driven by climate change, as this is not the case at the current time and will not be in the decades to come. So these are the 3 main points that I would like you to remember when I talk about our research, because these are the basis of where we start. The justification of this study, or why should we care about this topic? Since the 1970s, we have already experts that are trying to raise awareness of possible climate migrants or climate refugees. And at the same time, we have international institutions which are dedicated to these topics, and they are telling us in different reports that the greatest single impact of climate change could be on human migration, and with millions of people being displaced. These are very strong quotes, if you want to, and already in the IPCC in 1990 we could find them, also in the Stern Review in 2006, and also more recently in the new IPCC special report that was released last year. They tell us these are associated with climate extremes, influence population mobility and relocation, affecting host and origin communities. At the same time, or almost parallel, we have a lot of experts who start projecting numbers. The people is always interested in numbers. How many? From where to where? Tell me how many will be. I mean, this was the case also in Mexico. They're always telling us, okay, you're talking about probabilities because our model gives you probabilities, but give me actual numbers. Until then, I won't listen to you. So we start hearing numbers that range from 20 million to 200 million by 2050. We thought, okay, that's interesting. That's very big numbers. And at the same time, we have other field of studies that start getting interesting. One of them is the security field of study. And we have a lot of experts, think tanks, and so on, that they start to securitize. And in certain aspects, when the military also tries to give their opinion, starts to get a bit militarized as well. The aspect of climate-induced migration. So they tell us that climate change poses a threat to national security, with climate-induced migration as the most worrying problem associated with rising temperatures and sea levels. And they also tell us that the movement of hundreds of millions of people could trigger major security concern and spike regional tensions. So this was for us the reason why we decided to think of quantitative analysis as well, because we really wanted to see, could this be the reality for a place like Mexico, a country that by default is a migration country. And we wanted to understand, if these numbers, at least for the Mexican reality, could reflect the reality of the country. So it was interesting for us to take on board these definitions and the work from other experts to see how far we could go. The importance of Mexico. So as I said, we were working in the region for some years, but we thought that Mexico was the perfect laboratory for several reasons. The first one is that migration is a defining characteristic of modern Mexico. Also, the environmental changes continue to affect Mexico. Experts from the UNAM tell us that the average temperature is expected to rise up to 4 degrees by the end of the century. And the same goes for the average precipitation that is expected to decrease by 11% in the same period. At the same time, we see that the impacts of climate variability in Mexico is affecting the key resources in the region in different level, depending on where you are. In the north, with desertifications; in the south, with massive floods. And then we see how this could be interconnected with the security landscape in the country. And finally, we think that, and sometimes is one of the most important aspects, is that the government is very supportive of these topics and very open for research, for new initiatives that tackle mainly climate change, but also all the repercussions. So I guess for any institute that tries to do policy, it's very important to have the support from the people that actually take decisions, and that they are keen to at least listen to what you're saying. So we thought that Mexico had all these, and we decided to go on with the case study. Our approach, or the methodology we decided to use, as I mentioned just before, we have a quantitative as well as a qualitative analysis. In the quantitative analysis, we decided to borrow some econometric models. It's called the multinomial logit model, which was developed specifically for us for this study. And as an input, it uses demographic data that we call characteristics of population and household that we used from the national census, the latest one, the 2010. And it also uses climate variables, mainly temperature and precipitation. We use international models, recognized models, that to give us good results. And we also decided to have an extra variable, which is it is not included in the results, but it's there in case anyone wants to know what happened with soil. So it's the soil characteristics at the municipal level used by INEGI, the National Institute for Statistics in the country, based on maps from the FAO. The multinomial logit model, incorporates all these key variables, including these climate variables, temperature and precipitation, and determines the ability to influence the decision to migrate. So we wanted to see if these climate variables have any impact in the decision to migrate. So we're talking about probabilities at this point. And we wanted to look if it was on internal as well as international migration at a national level as well as at a regional level. We didn't go into state or municipal level due to some factors. First, lack of time. This report was for basically yesterday, So it's always the case that we never have enough time to do what we really want to do. And also lack of enough data that we needed to do at the micro level, so that means municipal level. But we have at the national and regional, and this could be further developed. I mean, this is just the first steps of econometric model. In terms of the qualitative analysis, we had an extensive literature review, also a lot of interviews with experts and legislators and the civil society. We had a literature review on the determinants of migration, covering the econometric aspect of the study, as well as history and discussion of climate change and migration in Mexico, the analysis of the possible impact, and also we decided to have one chapter that looks at the qualitative with the quantitative analysis, like how do they merge, in which points we can find the support of the literature review, and actually the models show us the same, okay? So the key findings. First of all, preliminary advances we have a preliminary advances towards a deeper understanding of this possible nexus in climate, migration, and security. We also found that the significance, the statistical significance, and the changes in probability from the model that we use are non-zero, are different than zero, indicating that internal and international migration in Mexico is linked to changes in temperature and precipitation. It has an impact and has an effect at the moment of migrating. Now, the decision to take, when a migrant takes the decision, the climate variables do have an impact because are different than zero. Therefore, climate variables should be included in future models, aim at determining the variables that include the decision to migrate. Also, climate variability is a determinant in the decision to migrate, and the security risks will mainly be associated with resource stress. That's the availability and management of key resources, both in sending communities as well as in recipient communities. Most on the communities that receive all these migrants, if you want, because of the overpopulation that they will get. I mean, the lack of infrastructure to manage the status quo, and then plus they get all this influx of people. It put even more pressure on their infrastructure, on their system, and of course on their resources. Some other key findings: the resource stress may arise in places already vulnerable, as I mentioned, to overcrowding, leading to resource scarcity and potential heightening existing tensions. Here we see that our model indicates that migration from northern states should decrease if the annual mean precipitation were to increase, alleviating water stress, basically in border countries, or border states, I'm sorry. The opposite is true for the southern states, where there is limited water stress. Basically, increasing precipitation would actually lead to an increase in migration. So if we think of places like Tabasco, at the current time, it's receiving a lot of migrants, but this is due to an economic aspect because of Pemex had a lot of installations there, and economically is offering the possibility to a lot of Mexicans to work there. But it's a very vulnerable state, prone to lots of floods, and in our model belongs to the southern group. And as we said, southern states that have limited water stress, this could, with an increase of precipitation, this could lead to migration. So basically, Tabasco, even now it's receiving a lot of migrants, they could actually leave due to various reasons. One could be indeed flood or severe floods. Also, in terms of food security is threatened by increasing irregularities in the rainy seasons, brought about climate change or climate variability. And desertification causes land abandonment, where the production of primary sources occurs and could cause serious problems of food insecurity. Again, if we look at the model tells us that an increase in the mean annual temperature increases the probability to migration, as that is currently happening in the north of the country. And those communities which will not migrate as an adapted response will have to put in place resilient practices. If we look into the results of the model very quick, just to give you an idea what we did. I mean, what I just mentioned to you are our key findings and as a whole, but also, of course, we wanted to just show you what the model could do or did with the data that we put as an input. The general observations, for some of them are very coherent with previous studies on migrations without the climate variability aspect, and tell us, for instance, that internal and international migrants most likely will be males of working age, which this is true. The level of education positively impacts internal migration, but negatively impacts international migration with increased levels of education. And higher wealth negatively impacts internal migration, but positively impacts international migration. So this is, I mean, this is not new, and I guess a lot of experts have already said this, and our model showed that, and so that gave us a little bit more confidence of what we're doing. Looking at the climate variability and the observations on temperature and precipitation, we see that higher average temperatures enhance the probability of both internal and international migration. We also see that an increased average in precipitation reduces the probability of internal migration, but enhances international migration. And finally, they identify impacts observed from both models that we use, the Hegemon 1 and the MIROC model, agree with each other. And any econometric model that an expert would like to use, you also need to look at the marginal effects. What would it happen if, everything stays constant, all the variables stay constant, but you just change one? And we decided to change each of them, but of course I'm just going to present you the changes in temperature and precipitation. So what we see is that an increasing the temperature by 1 degree increases the probability of internal migration, but decreases the probability of international migration. An increase in average precipitation by 1 millimeter per year decreases the probability of internal migration, but increases the probability of international migration. We also had some interesting results on the marginal effects that show that the increase in temperature has a greater influence in the decision to migrate of Mexicans than gender, for instance. At least the model shows us that. And the impact of an additional year of schooling is positive for domestic migration and negative for international migration. And of course, the marginal effects observed from this model are again used by these international models that they were coherent with each other and they agree with each other. The benefits and the limitations. Every model has its limitations. Of course, the benefits, as you may all already understand from what I'm talking to you today, is to bridge the gap between policy and science. And that's why we decided to go and work with scientists that could really help us to understand better the subject from all angles. And also that we were able to demonstrate statistically that the probability that a Mexican migrant, will either leave its place of origin or cross the border are influenced by many factors, and one of them is temperature and precipitation. Of limitations, as always, these, and as I mentioned at the very beginning, this model cannot predict absolute numbers. We're just talking about probabilities. But anyway, this is a first step of qualitative as well as quantitative analysis in order to understand the possible relationship between climate change, migration, and security. And also, it should be noted that when we use the demographic data from the last census, the Mexican census, It happens actually that in Mexico, many people do not register their internal movements, and this could cause a loophole, in the results, unfortunately. But we work with whatever data were available at the present time. And future steps, what we'd like to do next. Of course, this is, as I said, just the beginning, and we could actually use this model to look into more detail at the state level, and maybe at the municipal level. We do have the atmospheric data with municipal resolution, so we could just have a better team, like with more people and more time, and we could maybe find these results in terms of probabilities. But if we would like to have actual numbers, we would like to use some other models, like the general equilibrium model, and we could use some case studies, like maybe Michoacán, which is an exploratory state, and we will be able to see, first, since we already have the probabilities, we will be able to see how many are coming to Michoacán or live in Michoacán due to environmental change. And finally, some of the recommendations, actually, Duncan already mentioned them all, basically. No problem. At the final part of this report, you will be able to find the recommendations in detail, and I don't really want to go in detail. But of course, increase awareness of climate-induced migration in Mexico. Just recently, they have adopted the general law of climate change, which is well recognized and has been applauded internationally. And they do mention, the most vulnerable people, and they also analyze possible ways of adaptation for this group of people, the most vulnerable ones. But they don't mention, of course, that climate change is a determinant in the decision to migrate. And this could be, they do have already a legal framework that they could just modify slightly. They also have the Ley de Migración, it's a migration law, which has been recently adopted as well. Again, there, when they explain why a person migrates, they mention all possible aspects but climate change or changes in the climate. And so it could be interesting or important to maybe modify a bit the definitions already in place. The same goes with their national security law that does not mention the changes in the climate or the extreme weather events or the resources stressed as a possible threat for national security or as a problem that they should mainly address. But they do have in place these legal documents that they just need to be a bit modified. And then further enhance coordination and management between institutions. They do have a lot of institutions placed that I would see a little bit of overlapping, because every institution we visit, every person that was there was basically looking at climate change, but there's not much coordination. And establish annual vulnerability assessments, promote planned relocation. When we talk about planned relocations, of course, internally, but internationally also promote managed migration opportunities, legal managed migration opportunities, and promote information dissemination at all levels. One of the reasons why we had to generate the data is because they are not publicly available. Well, actually, they are none. So that could be quite interesting to take. And finally, all the acknowledgements. As you can see, we collaborated with a lot of people. You can see the endless emails, the talks, telephone calls that we did, and we're very thankful to all of them. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Michael, why don't we turn the floor directly over to you?
Thank you very much, Jeff, and thanks, Duncan, for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here at Wilson Center. And Elizabeth and Jorge in absentia, let me congratulate you to this great report. This is the gold or the purple standard, for that matter, in the field. This is really a good example how you combine quantitative and qualitative research. No, I won't pretend I understand all the multi-nominal logit models that you have in there. I take your word for it. But it is really important to give it a scientific base, because that's a political problem that we run into consistently, that people say, as you mentioned, so what is the proof of what you're saying besides anecdotal evidence? And I think this is a very important achievement, and even though you are not yet able to quantify the numbers, and they don't seem to be overly dramatic, the fact that you're able to have a quantitative model that establishes that link is really important. As you know, Susan Martin here from Georgetown University has done a similar report on Mexico a couple of years ago, and she said that it was difficult to identify the exact factors and set up a nexus between climate change and migratory movements. But from a policy perspective, for me, that's enough. If there's insecurity and uncertainty about outcomes, especially when you look 10, 15, 20 years in the future, I would say uncertainty is a greater incentive for action than certainty. Because if you're uncertain if the traffic light works, you look twice whether there's a car that's going to run you over. And I think at a policy level for the US government, that is even more true, because if you want to plan for contingencies and for future scenarios, then you need to be able to do so, even if you do not have all the data at hand that you may need for this. And I think in that sense that you bring these issues together in a comprehensive manner is a great achievement. I thought one aspect that you draw upon that you have not mentioned here in your presentation, the fact that climate change is an agent of inequality as well, because it touches communities in different ways and in different manners, is an important dimension. And especially when you talk in the second part of the report about the longer-term issues, especially when it comes to water scarcity, food security. 20 million Mexicans might be exposed to food insecurity in the future. That is interesting, because it really shows that all the parameters that we have at hand are indicating that we are moving towards a direction where climate will have greater influence on migratory movements, on human livelihoods, and so on and so forth. So I think this is really a fantastic achievement. I also appreciated that you have an extensive part of the report mentioning the reactions of the Mexican government between 2006 and 2012, because the Mexicans, under President Calderon and hopefully under the new administration, really have taken up a leadership role in many of those issues. And that's important, because Mexico is a country that can be a model for other environments in other places in the world where we have similar problems, or where those issues are even more dramatic than they are in the Mexican case. And hopefully the new boss of Pemex, Emilio Lozoya, when he said in Davos a few weeks ago that he wants to make his big old national oil behemoth into a thought leader when it comes to climate change, I really hope he follows up on that promise, because that would be a great step forward. Let me, for the sake of the discussion, maybe not take issue, but comment on what you have said about the threat of securitization or militarization of the issue. And of course, I work in the national security team. We are slightly more simplistic people, because we look at the world sometimes too often in notions of good and bad, and from a very operational level of what you may need to do. And I think I would just suggest that the argument is a bit more complicated. You mentioned this one Global Business Network report where there is this vision of hundreds of thousands of Mexicans storming the U.S. border. That report hasn't really played much here in Washington. And quite to the contrary, we've been working very hard not to keep the military or the security folks out of that conversation, but rather the opposite, to introduce notions of sustainability and awareness about climate migration and the potential in the future into security debates, because we think that's important. And you mentioned the QDR, the Quadrennial Defense Review. In 2010, for the first time, finally, climate change was as an accelerant as instability featured in that report. And Secretary Gates and also Secretary Panetta both have come out and have said pretty smart things about the relationship between longer-term sustainable development policies, decreasing the need for military action. And I think that's a discussion that we need, that's a discussion that we are involved in, and that's a debate that we need to push for several reasons. One of them being in a situation where we need an enlightened military leadership to look at those issues. And especially in the US Navy, you have those people. Some of them, when they are serving, cannot speak maybe as bluntly as they would like to, but especially if you talk to retired Navy personnel here in the United States, and a number of them are at the board of the Center for Naval Analysis, a Pentagon-affiliated think tank, you'd be surprised of how conscious those former military leaders are about the issues that we're talking about. And that has to do with the fact that the Navy increasingly becomes the 911 number for disaster relief. And I think this is a fact of life, maybe not so much in Mexico, and I would agree with you that this might not be the prime example for talking about the relationship between security and the larger development issues. But in other parts of the world, it is just omnipresent. And we have done reports focusing on the nastier parts of that discussion. We have done one report on Northwestern Africa, where we look at two Saharan countries, Nigeria, Algeria, and Morocco, that are connected by anywhere between 65 and 100,000 migrants that go through the Sahara from sub-Saharan countries towards the northern African shore in order to enter Europe. And we've looked at India and Bangladesh, where you, of course, have a history that goes back all the way to the late 1970s, early 1980s, of not only ethnic and political conflicts along the issue of Bangladeshi immigration into Assam, but also the so-called Assamese student movement converting into a political party, which is still a powerful player in Assam, hedging on those issues and cashing in on anti-immigrant resentment. And this is nothing abstract. I mean, in July of last year, because of that setting, there were conflicts between the indigenous Bodo tribes in northern Assam and Muslim immigrants, Muslim settlers from Bangladeshi background. And they not only claimed 40 lives within the scope of very, very few days, but it's also caused 170,000 people to flee their homes. Thanks to social media, Twitter, Facebook, people were disseminating that information. There was a massive impact all over India because many of these Assamese migrants work in the subcontinent, and people rushed back home. So I think there is a real challenge. We've also been looking in a new report that we'll publish 2 weeks from now in the Andean region. And here again, you have a convergence of unregulated exploitation of natural resources, climate change impact, especially at the border region in the central Brazilian areas, and that belt from south central Brazil to the Bolivian and Peruvian border region, where you have tremendous water scarcity, a lot of energy and mineral resources that are being exploited now, but you also have a tremendous development of the new flows of cocaine traffic, which are basically opening up spaces because there is little governments, communities are overwhelmed, the climate impact is disowning farmers and pushing them into sectors of the illicit economy. And for the Brazilians, that is not an abstract question either. President Rousseff put in that integrated border monitoring system. They spent $6.5 billion on this and will have deployed over 48,000 soldiers by 2019 in that border region. So I think this is important not only from a U.S. policy perspective, but also domestically for these countries. If we are not part of that conversation, what you say is happening exactly, namely that you'll have a securitized conversation where people in the armed forces or in the security sector are making those decisions, and we're not part of that conversation. The last example I wanted to draw upon is when we did our research on Northwest Africa, and it's well known, Lake Chad down to 1/20th of its size since 1960. Nigeria loses 3,500 square kilometers of arable land due to desertification. Nigeria has lost 200 villages in the last 20 years. We've put that on the cover of our report just to give you a visual impression of what that means when the Sahara is eating up your villages. So you have a really complex situation there already, and that is of course compounded by regional, ethnic and political conflict and migratory flows through exactly that region. But it is also the case that when we did research on our South America report, that we stumbled over really interesting connections in this illicit environment, namely Mexican and Colombian cartels setting up shop in Western Africa and flying large amounts of cocaine out of Venezuela, but also out of Brazil into Mali, into Niger, and then using those migratory routes to move the product to the expanding European market. The U.S. cocaine market is shrinking. European markets are expanding. So I'm not saying that this is like climate-induced, but I think if you take a step back and we look at the climate change impact and displacing people and moving people around, there is an entire set of issues that are really important to think about. And I'm not saying that there's a simplistic connection that you say this results in terrorism or in ethnic conflict, but there is, especially in the Sahara, there is an overlay that is very reminiscent of what happened to the FARC when it deteriorated in southern Colombia, because about 30% of the migratory flow and the cocaine traffic is managed by AQIM affiliated groups. I'd say there's a big gray zone. There's everything from hoodlums to people that are really believing in the Islamist cause and destroying the West. So it is not an alarmist note that I would sound, but there is certainly something going on. And if you find crashed Boeing aircrafts in northern Mali that have flown tons of cocaine out of Venezuela, you know that there's a real business model there. And it's interesting, this is sophisticated in the sense that along those established migratory routes in the Sahara, I mean, these convoys are sometimes patrolled by those insurgent groups or however you want to call them, with GPS equipped four-wheel drive vehicles. They're heavily armed, and they have even put up landmines in strategic places to make sure that they're not intercepted. So it's interesting. It's fascinating in a way because it's globalization, and it's probably in its most negative form, but it's a fairly successful business model, and I think we need to look at that. If you add Mali to the mix, where the fact that the Tuareg tribes joined the Islamist uprising against the central government was in great part driven by lack of infrastructure, lack of governance, exposure to climate-induced scarcity. This becomes even more important. So I'm saying this because I think the work we do has a certain value, and I would argue we need to be aggressive in the sense that we don't say we want to have our discussion and keep the security dimension out of it. I would say the work we do to talk about complex crisis scenarios where climate change, human mobility, and conflict come together in ways that we've not seen or not looked at before, that changes the prism and the scope in which we look at global politics and international relations. And I think this is the task that we have, to enlighten that conversation and exactly move it away from that Cold War logic where it's mostly about counting warheads or having military assets in place as a way of how you define power, but become more sophisticated at playing this new, if you will, a three-dimensional chess game where you have traditional power, diplomacy, but also development issues intertwined in a way that we don't fully comprehend yet because this is a new era. And so bringing this back to the Mexico report, I think the report is an important building block in that conversation. I think it is very important to make sure that we argue vehemently that this issue cannot be securitized, but at the same time, we cannot pretend that it won't if we say so and if we don't look at it, because part of it has security dimensions already that we can't really get around. So Mexico might not be the best test case for my argument. It is probably a very good test case for your argument. But then again, I would say if more massive numbers of people were to move in Mexico, we would come into a situation where we have the Northwest Africa, the Bangladesh, or the Central South America discussion popping up, and clearly there is that dimension. So congratulations again. It's a great report. I've already sent it around, and I hope people read the 100 pages. It's really worthwhile reading. And I don't say that often about 100-page reports, but this is really helpful for our conversation here in Washington. So thank you again.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Michael, and again, thank you, Elizabeth. We have a good chunk of time for discussion of the report and obviously the specifics of the findings there. And I would echo Michael's point about the the value that comes with the hard work of putting the quantitative and the qualitative together. Not everyone does it. More often it's one or the other, and not the two. That has been since the methodological fights of the 90s on environment security, environment conflict has been a common characteristic that there's lots of talking past one another. And so Elizabeth and her colleagues are to be commended for putting those together in the same cover and having them and those different folks work together, because they often can be very different languages. So let's have a discussion that both engages on the report in Mexico specific, and then also obviously an opportunity to engage in the broader climate migration sets of discussions, where I think both of our speakers wisely couch it in complexity and the challenge of parsing it out, but also that kind of in some ways, depending on where you sit in the portfolios that you have, you're going to take and make use of some of the same analysis in different ways, and as a forum that tries to reflect that diversity and be a forum for those different portfolios and perspectives to come together here at the Wilson Center historically on these issues. We look forward to the kind of conversations between those perspectives as well as within them. So who would like to kick us off with a discussion? As I mentioned, because we're webcasting it, we would like you to use a microphone so the folks online can hear. So we have two down here, Dan, and on the outside as well. If you could just let us know as well your name and affiliation, that'd be terrific. Thank you, Lauren.
Okay. Dan Martin, Conservation International. You didn't mention the very dramatic changes that have occurred in Mexico in human fertility. I can't imagine how changes in human fertility wouldn't have a major impact on human migration. What are your thoughts about that? Why did you leave it out?
Mm-hmm. Population. And Dan, if you could just put over here, why don't we capture a couple and then we can have a discussion here.
Jean Boucher, I'm PhD sociology at George Mason University. I'd just like maybe some clarification when you mentioned that climate change is having a greater effect on migration than gender.
We have one more for the mix before we turn it over to perhaps Elizabeth to talk, or why don't we go with those two first? Elizabeth, kind of clarifying in terms of what's in and what's out of the model.
Okay, so in any econometric model, you can choose the variables that could, reflect more or less. No. So that question came up also in Mexico. I mean, we presented this report at the UNAM to scientists specifically, and also in the Congress and so forth. We decided to choose the variables, first of all, that we had the data available for, and also that could help us to answer the main question that we had. I mean, people was asking us, why didn't you put security variables in the model? Or why didn't you put maybe, or reflecting variables, the pain that the migrants have when they leave their communities? It depends from which field of study you come, and then you see the angles you would like to look at this model. Of course, this model can be modified, and it would be very interesting, and thank you for mentioning it, how the human fertility will come into the model and what aspects of the probability will have in the decision to migrate of Mexicans. However, we use some of the major variables that the census provided us, in terms of on the individual, at the individual level, as well as a household level, because that's what the census give us. But in the qualitative analysis, we do mention the fertility aspect without putting into the model. We mentioned a couple of studies that look at the human fertility. I mean, we know that, for instance, in places like Mexico City, fertility has gone down massively, but in other places has increased, and it has increased in places where they receive these help from the government, like oportunidades, so it has had sometimes a negative effect, if you want to, because they know they will receive cash for their children, and so sometimes this has pushed into increase, the number of children that per family. So I think that I don't know if I have answered your question, but I think it's a very important aspect of the problem as a whole. And I think that in a different model, especially if we want to quantify these flows, it could be interesting to put the variable of fertility specifically in this context. However, the census give us, numbers of how many individuals live in one house and how many of them are children, or how many we use in this model just the age of the working age. Okay, that's what we took into consideration, and so there are many other aspects that we could use in order to reflect that. Related to the climate change that is greater to gender, this is just a quantitative aspect. The probabilities, of course, when we did the marginal effects, that means leaving everything a status quo, all the variables static, and just increasing one by like one year. For instance, if we look at age, or in temperature 1 degrees, and then everything living constant, we realize that if we do that with gender, the impact in probability was smaller than if we would have done that with temperature. And that was just the comment that I mentioned. That surprisingly, because we were quite surprised to see that the model will show us that. Of course, that could be also debatable, and I agree that especially people who look at gender studies might even disagree with that. But that was what the results of the model gave us. But in any case, the model gave us also very positive results regarding to, age and the wealth of migrants, that they were constant or were in agreement with results that we look at other papers or at other work from experts in the field.
We have some other questions. We have Peter over here, and then a couple. Why don't we do this side of the table, then work our way down?
Peter Sawyer from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. I had a question for you, Elizabeth, about the marginal effects that you looked at. What was your rationale for the differential impact on domestic versus international migration? I can't remember the exact relationship, but it's like when rain went up, it was international, and when it down, domestic. If you just talk a little bit more about that. Thanks.
And then, Kate, if we could just bring it down, the two down here with Duncan.
Hi, Avelina Ruiz, research consultant independently. Do you distinguish urban and rural as migrant forces and the effects that could have after the models? I mean, I don't distinguish how you distinguish those different kind of migrants and how could that affect in both. I have another, but it's more complicated, so maybe I will just
Hand it to Duncan.
Hi, Duncan Wood, Wilson Center. Elizabeth, I wonder if you could comment on, you mentioned the states of Tabasco and Michoacan in particular, but which other states would you say are particularly vulnerable in this case? And I'm not sure if the gentleman over here, was your question answered?
About gender?
Yes, yeah, or completely?
Sort of.
She admitted that
Okay.
people intergender find issue with it, so it's
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Well, just to add, so in sociology we talk about the problem of the two sexes, which is like they're apples and oranges. They're not really comparable because women generally support men and men aren't always supporting women. Although we have seen an increase at the border with women in migration, traditionally it's generally the working men, which you did say. So
Yeah.
that was all, but thank you.
Okay, why don't we take those three?
Okay. Gosh, I think it was the marginal effects, the first one, right? You were asking me what were the rationale behind the...
Just how you made sense of the data. So why do you think it was different?
Yeah, in terms of the marginal effects, of course, as I said, increasing temperature by 1 degree increases the probability of internal migration, but decreases the international migration. So that's why we had, and the same goes with the average precipitation, that decreases the probability of internal migration, but increases the probability of international migration. So they are not coherent with each other, and that's why, as a general key finding, or if you want to summarize them, this is also because of the climatologies in Mexico. Like they are very different from region to region, and what it affects in the north might not be the case in the south, as I mentioned previously, and the effects of it could vary. They can contradict each other, but in overall, we saw that increase of temperature, that would move. That is a key, let's say, factor in the decision to migrate internally as well as internationally on temperature. But when it comes to precipitation, due to the marginal effects and the contradictory results, if you want to, we cannot generalize as a key finding. So if that answers your question.
Okay. And then the other two.
Sorry.
No, that's all right. That's all right.
In terms of how we distinguish rural and urban migration, right? The census, there are specific census that look only onto rural, the rural census, if you want to. I can't remember the exact name of the census. Dr. Mora, who is the co-author and who actually is the one who developed the econometric model, he did a previous work for the World Bank in which he basically developed this model at a much basic level, because that was the basis for the logit multinomial that we use for this project. But actually he used that one in 2009. And in that study, that I will be happy to send it to you if you leave me your data afterwards, or your email address or something. In that study, he only looked at the rural aspect, because you have to use a different set of data. The national census doesn't make that doesn't distinguish like from rural to urban, but there is another specific census that looks only into rural movements, and that's what he used for his previous study, combining this also with climate variabilities, temperature and precipitation at a much let's say, less sophisticated level of what we have now, because this is like the continuation of that previous paper that he also had. And there you would be able to see, at the rural level, how the impacts would be. And I think he also actually in that study has a gender aspect, but also because he used different set of data, the focus was different and the question of the research was very different. And so he looked at the most vulnerable ones. And actually the continuation of this research that we have, or the idea that we are talking already with some colleagues back in Mexico, is to try to look at case studies, for instance, like Michoacan, because of the expulsory aspect of as a state that it has, and look at the most vulnerable in that stage, which are the indigenous population. Right now in Mexico, the indigenous population are around like 10 million or a bit more, and are the ones that are living in the most precarious conditions, and they are very much segregated in areas that are they have lack of sewage, or they have lack of water and the basic facilities. And so we thought that maybe the continuation for this study could be to look at the most vulnerable one at the state level and see, for example, if water is a determinant in the decision to migrate off indigenous populations in a vulnerable state. And that could answer maybe one of your questions, or like your question regarding of which other states. Certainly the northern states, as well as the southern states, Yucatan and all the peninsula, is very vulnerable to all sort of extreme weather events, but also to onset and offset events of climate change. And if we would have had the time and the resources to further look into it with greater detail at the micro level, we would certainly have chosen some case studies at the state level to further enhance the data that we have and the results that we found. But we try to do our best with a regional aspect, because it already gives you a sense of how different the climatologies, the climates are in the different regions, and what the effects are for certain population of the country and for certain other groups, depending on where they are.
Duncan, you're good with your question in terms of the regional district? Okay, terrific. How about some more comments? There are a couple other hands. Ma'am, down here in front. Well, we'll get you, and then at the back of the table. We need a couple more lights in the back there so I can see those hands. Please.
Hi, Rachel Jonathan, Senior Science Advisor at LMI for climate change. My question to you, Elizabeth, is concerning the actual data that you use in the modeling effort. You made reference to the Hadley GCM and use of the A1B scenario, but I didn't see reference to actual use of climate data from Mexico. So my question is, were there actual observational data involved in this analysis, or was this more a hypothetical analysis of how a hypothetical change in climate would influence migration? And if so, then could you explain how the statistical evaluation probabilities from the model could be accomplished to actually perform a test of significance of the change in a probability?
Okay, and thank you very much. And right there in the back.
Hi, my name is Jackie Powell from WASH Advocates, and I would just love if you could speak a little bit more about the water aspect of this. Flipping through the report, I see water pop up a lot, and access to water. I also see one of the variables as sanitation, which also hasn't been touched upon, and I also just wanted to comment that I think it's really wonderful that you're thinking of a follow-up research on vulnerable populations and their access to water and how that affects this whole situation. So, yeah, thank you.
Terrific. Are there other hands? And again, apologies if the darkness obscures them. Well, then maybe I'll take the opportunity too to ask Elizabeth. It's obviously the report is just coming out, but if you could perhaps say a bit more about the dialogue with the government going forward, and what you have had and what you hope to have, and in part you've given us some sense of the suggestions and the implications that you draw from it, but your sense of the opportunities going forward to put that into effect and see it happen. And in fact, maybe make that also a question for Michael in terms of more broadly the policymakers and decision makers you're engaging with, your thoughts and observations on how they're using it, given, as you both talked and rightfully, I think, emphasized the complexity that different folks with different portfolios are going to draw different conclusions, in part because they have different objectives and different toolboxes to respond. But maybe your senses of optimism and pessimism about the ability of those folks to effectively talk and meet some of those needs, because obviously no one group has all the answers and all the tools to deal with it, and half of the battle is then finding creative ways to coordinate those responses. But Elizabeth, perhaps you could jump in.
For the models, first of all, I am not the scientist who developed neither the model nor the climate variabilities, so my answer would be limited, and I will be happy to put you in contact with the people who help us to do that, because I don't want to jump into a topic that I am very generalist. But in any case, we use these two models because are internationally the most recognized. One is from the UK and one is from Japan. And we could have used other models, but we talked with scientists in the UK, in Mexico, and they all use these two models. So they thought that if you want to go with the flow of scientists and what they do, then use these models in the first place. In terms of the statistical evolution, again, I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly and how statistical, I mean, I can tell you how statistically significant it was and how the marginal effects will show us if one variable is more important than the other and what could be as a probability more important than the decision to migrate. But again, I will not be able to tell you the differences on the probability from one to the other, just because I wouldn't like to get into detail of the model itself. But I will be happy to put you in contact with our people, okay, if that helps a little bit. In terms of the water aspect, we decided to cover a whole section on water for several reasons. First, because water, I guess, is essential in this type of research, and also because there is a Ministry of Water, which is called Conagua in Mexico, and they were very supportive of this research, and they help us a lot, especially with the data that they provided us and the part of the peer review. So we decided to focus a lot on what they do and also on the aspect of water, because it's so important and is basically a key aspect in this nexus and between climate change, migration, and security. In the census, there was a question in terms of sanitation and sewage, and if you will see in the results that we have in the numbers, I mean, these tables look a bit confusing and everything, but you will see that the variables are there and the water variable is there. That's why we would like to focus specifically on water, because we have already the data available. Now we would like to go a step forward and say, okay, is water a determinant in the decision to migrate for this vulnerable population, yes or no? And the data are there. We just need to further exploit them if you want to. In terms of the qualitative analysis, we do talk about the aspect of sanitation. There is more than 40 million people in Mexico that doesn't have access to water at the present time. And we mentioned this and what would be their repercussions and why it is important. I mean, it's not just important to have water, but to have clean water. I mean, we got data that says, oh, look, but we have 4 more million that got water. But is that water potable? I mean, like, is it clean water? Well, yes, no. And so there are like a lot of questions on how many people actually do have access to this water and how many people actually can use this water. And this could also be a factor that we could include in a much more detailed model. So if that could help. And then regarding the dialogue, as I mentioned before, I spent a week in Mexico presenting this report, trying to talk to all the stakeholders and all the governmental dependencies that help us to collect the data and through the peer review process. And it culminated with a presentation on the Congress yesterday, at the Mexican Congress. And what I mentioned at the very beginning is that Mexico is a country that you can have a dialogue about climate change, because they are leaders right now, especially in the region and internationally very much recognized as a country that really cares about these aspects, and they are trying to look for for solutions and also for international cooperation as well as regional cooperation. They are trying to include these topics in every major international talks that they have, and they are becoming really leaders in these. And so for them is also this type of research, I mean, has been welcome in a sense that it gives you some like the start of something that they could build upon. Some people tell me, oh yeah, but you're just talking about probabilities and not of actual numbers. But I had a comment at the Congress yesterday that it was it gave me some hope, if you want to. One senator told me, actually, I like the idea of probabilities, because if the probability becomes true, then this is what would happen. But this is a if you want, is not reactive measure that you're asking us to take on over, but a preventive one. So if we talk about probabilities, you might be able, if you want to listen to what we're telling you, you might be able to adopt preventive solutions rather than giving you actual figures and numbers, and you start using reactive solutions. So, yeah.
Michael, your experience with the
Yes.
consumers?
Maybe just one word. I think the water dimension is really an important and crucial one, not only because Mexico uses so much, almost half of its water for agriculture, and the population from surface sources, and the problems in Mexico City are well known. I still remember the 1990s when Lago Chapala was basically drunk empty by Mexico City, which was 400 miles away. But it has also an interesting regional dimension because the U.S. and the northern Mexican states are increasingly managing water resources jointly, and that is, I think, an interesting dimension, just as a footnote. With regard to the U.S. government, I think it is as good as it gets under the current circumstances, where you have a small but very vocal minority in the U.S. Congress that still denies that climate change is in existence, and that has all kinds of repercussions for officials not really at times being able to speak about those issues in a way they would like or should speak about them. On the other hand, I think the U.S. government has made tremendous steps forward, especially under the leadership of Hillary Clinton, who has done the first quadrennial diplomacy and development review modeled after the QDR in the Defense Department, which is mandated by Congress, has to be done every 4 years. She has done a thorough review with a lot of pain and turf wars and everlasting postponement in the State Department and USAID. And I think that's an important first step. And Anne-Marie Slaughter, who was the Director of Policy Planning at the time and the leader of this process, has a tremendous achievement, I think, on her CV for having been able to push that through. My experience is that there is an increasing awareness in the Pentagon, and also an increasing respect for what the USAID does. There is acknowledgement, especially when it comes to people that work on human security within the development agency, that conversation with the Pentagon is necessary. Often it's just a question of resources, because the Pentagon is so much bigger that they can pull USAID people into so many meetings that they can't get their job done anymore. So this is just underlining the need for the second Obama administration to make sure that the resources are where they belong. On the other hand, again, that discussion, we need to have that conversation, because if you trust the recent numbers, there's probably more AFRICOM personnel in Africa than USAID personnel by now. So the U.S. is rapidly building up capability on the African continent, especially for covert action, but also for other issues. And so that conversation is necessary. But the problem is structurally that we're still very much stuck in a Cold War setup where there was a clear distinction between the three silos, between development, diplomacy, and defense, because you couldn't really bleed into the issues during the Cold War period without risking a war in parts of the world. And so that institutional structure, to a certain degree, is just limiting our political creativity. I think there are a lot of people in the administration that know that we need to push this. One of my former colleagues at the center, who started our sustainable security program, Gail Smith, is one of the senior advisors in the National Security Council on Development for the President. The President, for the first time, in his UN speech in 2011, said that long-term sustainable development strategies are part of U.S. national security strategy. Huge leap forward. Have they always followed through with what needs to be done? I'm not so sure. And looking at the immensity of the task, and again, Mexico is a great example, but it's not something where you constantly should lose sleep over, but there are other places in the world where regional interest, human livelihoods, and the fate of people that are living in those regions are at stake, that are tremendously challenging. So I think we need to speed up this conversation, and for that reason, meetings like this one today and your report are so important.
Terrific. Well, I'm afraid we've come to the end of the appointed time, but I think we've had a very rich conversation and set of presentations. We look forward to more work and follow-on work from both RUSI and the Center for American Progress, and then we hope you will continue to look to the Wilson Center, the Mexico Institute, the Environmental Change and Security Program to continue to facilitate these discussions here in the rooms at the Wilson Center, online with our respective online websites, and New Security Beat, our blog that tries to tackle these issues together. So please join me in thanking our guests for a very lively discussion.
The reason why it's out is because the government asked us to take it out. I mean, it was banned because we had a whole research or section on.
They are, I believe. I believe on the RUSI website. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Website at the center. If you send me an email, I can send you some documents. These are two separate projects on climate migration and the sustainable security, but we're closely interlinked. And the director of the program right now is John Norris. He's a former USAID official. Yeah, so he's running that program. So I'm going to send you the website and some information. No. No, there was a national intelligence report where water figured so prominently. That came from the intelligence agency. This is mostly CIA work, but it was really interesting because they had that list, right, of potential conflicts. It was water, water, water. So that's why we focus on the water. I think that's the crucial issue for the future. But sustainable security is more about developing long-term development strategies within the security framework. Right? I mean, and we try to push that conversation very, very hard, and it's reasonably successful. And the president has an open ear for those arguments as well, so it's going okay. But yeah, right, 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 yeah. Great. Yeah, if you can send me some information on what you do, I'd very much appreciate it. And I put
card.
I just finished my course in Mexico,
Okay.
but thank you so much. I will email everyone who gives it.
Could you email? I want to. Do you know Martha Delgado?
Yeah.
Right. I've known her. We correspond, and I told her I was coming today, and she like would love to get the report.
Yeah.
I've sent a couple of them here. It's a nightmare. It's like 2 months before it showed up.
Sure. Yeah, Laura has all the reports in English because we send like 100 copies, I think, or 150 copies. So they will be able to send you because it would be easier that they send you from here, from these two that I sent you from London.
Pardon?
That I sent you from London. I mean, I guess if she wants one report, and she can ask here the Woodrow Wilson Center, they will have one report for her.
Okay, so she can email here.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, yeah, because I know the environmental ministry is mentioned in the credits.
Yeah, no, that shouldn't be a problem. But if you give me your card, I
Yeah,
can send you
please,
the
yeah.
link where you can find it. And yeah,
That's the back of the card. But I scribbled her address on there. I didn't know.
No
what to do.
problem. But thank you so much for coming
Yeah,
today.
yeah. It's very interesting. I've known her for
And I
years.
hope,
I met her at Pioneers.